you would like to tell us where you're joining us from and why you're here, please do use the chat. That's what it's there for. So please let us know where you're joining us from. Great. Hi, Timothy. Hi, Timothy from Oxford, and Francesco from Italy. Good to see you here. Thank you for joining us. Okay, I think on that basis, we've got around 45 participants, so that's wonderful. I'm sure a few more will trickle in a moment. Hi to Alma from Maine, Barbara from France, Daniela from Denmark, Juliana from Italy, Yasmin. Hi everybody, thank you for joining us. So we're going to get started. My name is Tom Rowley. I run Open Democracy's coverage of Russia, Ukraine, the wider region, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this discussion today. Obviously, the events last weekend in Russia have really caught the public imagination, and for those of us following the war, have certainly given us food for thought and raised a lot of questions. Questions that appear to be at the moment without answers. So we're all following the situation very closely. We are joined by some really fantastic guests today. We have Hanna Liubakova, who is a Belarusian journalist and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. We have Jeremy Morris, who is Professor of Russian and Global Studies at the University of Aarhus. And we have Elizaveta Fokht, who is a BBC Russian service reporter who has done quite a lot of brilliant coverage on the Wagner Group. So we've got a fantastic lineup, and we also really want to help you answer any questions that you have insofar as that's possible. The fog of speculation, intrigue, war is certainly upon us, whether in Russian, Belarusian, English languages. If whatever media you're following, there is a lot of noise, speculation, and rumors going on. So lots to talk about. And so I do encourage you to ask our panelists questions. I'm going to start with perhaps the most naive but basic question, which is on the basis that we're now on Thursday afternoon, could I ask each of our panelists to say, do they think it was a coup? Jeremy, would you like to lead off, and then perhaps Lisa and Hannah, just a couple of words on that question. And if you have an alternative description, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So it seems like pretty much everybody is saying this was some kind of uprising or rebellion, and they're sticking with that kind of indeterminate definition. I would say it was at least partly or mainly about conflict within the elite over resources. It's not my phrase. This has been put out there by some other people. A business conflict settled by military means.
Okay, business conflict settled by military means. That's the first description from Jeremy. Hannah, could I ask you to join us on this?
Well, I think that was some of the most significant challenge to Lukashenko's rule, but I would like to focus still on Belarus because that's my area of expertise. And I'll add here that Lukashenko's role here was useful as a useful idiot. And we have seen in the past days that Belarus has been perceived as a vassal state by the Russians and by the Kremlin.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Lisa, I'm going to turn to you now. And obviously you've reported extensively on the Wagner Group, particularly over the past at least 7 months. We've all read your reporting. Could you join us, please, on this question?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. And as I'm not an expert, I'm a journalist. So for me, it was a mess. It was just something that on one hand we didn't expect. On the other hand, now it looks like it was like completely expected. Something that we should have expected. I don't think it's that important how you call it, a rebellion, business argument. I'm sure there are, like little aspects of everything in this whole, situation. But I think the most important thing is it's something that sort of like led us into this uncharted territory This is unprecedented in Russia, and in some way a new reality. I hope we're going to discuss different aspects of this new reality today with all of you.
Excellent, thank you, Lisa. That's a wonderful, eloquent description of the mess and the messy new reality that we're living in. Lisa, you just mentioned this point about expectations, and I think this is something that actually Hanna and Jeremy, I'm sure, have a perspective on. The events of Friday evening and Saturday morning, I mean, just seem to be going completely off script, right? This is an unscripted, this is some kind of, this is not in the narrative, right? This is not in the Kremlin's narrative about the war, or indeed about the reality inside the country. It's an independent kind of autonomous action. That's at least how it looks. We don't, you know, there is obviously speculation about that. The question for me is, given, and particularly these, obviously this relates to your reporting, given we've been observing these tensions between the Russian military defense and the Wagner Group, and obviously this kind of channel of criticism, was it expected in some sense, like that there would be this challenge of perhaps not the march, but of something?
Well, now I want to say, you know, like as a good panelist, yes, of course we could expect that. But the truth is, again, on Friday night, I don't think that everyone, I don't know a single person who wasn't shocked by that. And by saying like a single person, not only my colleagues, my experts, but also clearly, you know, I'm talking about, you know, the Russian elite. I'm talking about Russian, you know, security services, and frankly, Vladimir Putin himself. Of course, having said that, it's important to mention that this conflict between, you know, Evgeny Prigozhin, this warlord, the head and the founder of this Wagner Group private military company, even though I'm not sure we can call it private anymore, but because Putin yesterday actually admitted that it was fully funded by the state. So if it's a private military company, that's, I guess, for our audience to judge. But anyway, yeah, this conflict, you know, has really, really deep roots. Publicly, it started, you know, last autumn when Russia faced this humiliating defeat in Kharkiv and Kherson region, and Prigozhin was one of the most vocal critics of the Russian army. And that was something unprecedented too, because for years, Sergei Shoigu, the head of the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Defense itself, and the Russian army, they were something, as we would call in Russia, you know, holy cows. You couldn't really criticize them because, you know, like maybe you can criticize some things, but the army, it's something that beyond your like scope of criticism. And yet, in fact, Prigozhin and other actors like Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, they were very open about how they think that army generals are incompetent, without being personal at this point, must fall. But anyway, then it was clear that this conflict is not only, you know, it's not only just like a conversation about who's more effective, who knows how to run this operation in Ukraine, but yes, indeed, as Jeremy said, it's a conflict about resources, because Wagner and Prigozhin, they have been insisting for months that the MOD didn't give them enough, you know, artillery shells and weapons to advance on Bakhmut, this city in the Donetsk region that's now in ruins. Russia and, you know, Wagner actually managed to capture it after months of like heavy fighting. And during this advance on Bakhmut, Prigozhin was saying that the Ministry of Defense wasn't supportive enough. There are other, you know, aspects of this too. As you probably know, Prigozhin, since the last summer, for many months, he was recruiting prisoners from Russian penal colony. Again, something unprecedented, with the direct involvement of Vladimir Putin, because by law, he's the only person who can pardon those prisoners to send them to the front line to fight in Ukraine. So, but
I think this is a great point, actually. This is a great point on this unprecedented kind of channel, right, that is kind of changing Russia's reality. And I just want to stop you there if possible, just
sure.
kind of bring in our other panelists, because I think this is like one of the main questions that a lot of our readers are kind of concerned about, which is this unprecedented new reality. I'd like to ask Hanna just to come in, and then Jeremy on what this new reality looks like first for Belarus. I find this Belarus question very important because on the one hand, you have the public display apparently of Lukashenko as this kind of brilliant negotiator who can strike a deal, right, against this background, obviously, of signs that there is increasing integration and control of Belarus by the Russian leadership. And at the same time, you have Belarus as this kind of dumping ground, this exile zone for this section of the Wagner Group. And then I'd love to bring in Jeremy.
Right. So since Saturday, basically, Lukashenko has been benefiting, at least publicly, from this image of a wise ruler and skilled negotiator, as state propaganda in Belarus has been trying to show him. His role, of course, is unclear. If he was indeed someone who called Prigozhin, it's very hard to believe, because I think he played the role of a messenger, of just a middleman, and everything was perhaps agreed prior to that between the parties, and Lukashenko became just a public face to this deal and agreement. And of course, there are reasons why why Putin did not want to directly engage with Prigozhin, because it would have been diminishing, since like few hours before that, he called Prigozhin a traitor. So Lukashenko became this very convenient figure. What I think happened next was even more interesting, and also, of course, concerning for us as Belarusians. First, Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, said that Prigozhin is going to leave for Belarus, which is, again, a very interesting, humiliating phrase. Leave for Belarus. What does it mean? Then Putin, in his Monday's address late evening, basically offered the choice to Wagner militants who participated in the rebellion, and generally all of them, basically, they can sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense, go home, or go to Belarus. And again, that was even before Lukashenko spoke about the possibility of them coming to the country. So it all looked like both Peskov and Putin were deciding here, like were decisive. I think that already shows that Belarus, in their eyes at least, became some sort of a vassal state, some sort of a subordinate territory, where Putin sends someone he favored before, and where he sends militants who attempted a rebellion. So I think that one of the consequences for us, of course, when it comes to this sort of larger, longer term consequences, we can talk about this later. But what I would like also to mention, that I think the role of Lukashenko and basically this public image, because I think it's quite actually exciting. Like, he gave this address yesterday to top military, where he said that, I convinced Putin not to kill Prigozhin. I did this, I did that. So he's trying to sell his image as someone decisive, someone who played a huge role, which is, again, very interesting. Of course, it's kind of expected, because he does it all the time for his domestic audience. But I think also he's trying to win some points, perhaps among the Russian audience as well. It's a question whether Belarusians are going to buy it. And I'm going to mention, I think, this later. But now let's bring Jeremy perhaps here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hanna. Jeremy, please join us. This is a fantastic start. And I just want to encourage our audience as well to please send your questions in the chat. We're definitely going to pick up on them if we can.
Yeah, please do. I already, while Hanna was speaking, I just sent off an answer to one of them. So you started off by saying, Tom, we've gone off script. What I would emphasize is that we were already really, really far off script, right? And so in a sense, it seems unprecedented, and I agree it's unprecedented. But at the same time, it is part of the destabilization of the kind of compact in Russian society between the elite and the rest of the Russians that the war itself represents, right? So there's different ways of talking about this kind of going off script, right? Yes, it was even more unprecedented because clearly people didn't know quite how to react. Again, that's contained in the way that we don't still know what to call it, right? So different parts of the security services maybe have been seen to hesitate. There will be further repressions. There will also be a lot of resources redistributed, and again, maybe Elizaveta can talk about that. The enormous resources that Evgeny Prigozhin has amassed in a very short, relatively speaking, space of time. What will be the outcome there? So we also have Putin going severely off script, and that's perhaps one of the most interesting things, right? He's forced to intervene. He doesn't like to intervene. He likes things to kind of sort themselves out, and then for him to be seen as this invisible player that who is one step ahead of everybody. He was one step behind, right? He had to come out. He had to basically make a deal through Lukashenko. That makes him look doubly weak. He also, as we already mentioned, he admitted effectively lying, whereas he'd said not a year ago, Wagner's a private company and we have nothing to do with that, and blah, blah, blah. Now he's basically saying that an enormous amount of the military budget has been funneled exclusively to Wagner at the expense of everybody else and at the expense of every single man, woman, and child in Russia. He made that admission, right? Similarly, he says thanks for avoiding a civil war. And so a lot of people are going to be like turning around and saying, what, we could have had a civil war? Of course it makes him look weak. And that is the new reality. For me personally, in the research that I do, I'm less interested in him. I'm more interested in what this means for kind of regime stability, because you can have a regime continuing without Putin, what it means for kind of the balance of state structures, whether we're thinking of the different security forces, because of course Prigozhin was just one, and also what it means for the way ordinary people think about their country and think about the war. Because again, we haven't talked about the Ukraine war. All of this, of course, is caused by the invasion of Ukraine. And yes, it does represent, in some degree, the way that the war has come home in this unpredictable way, as you started off by saying, Tom.
No, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jeremy. I'm just going to encourage our readers once again, readers and viewers, to ask your questions. I wanted to pick out one thing I think that both Jeremy and Elizaveta have said, which is this idea of a battle for resources. And I always wonder if you could unpack that, like very briefly for our listeners and viewers. Like, what does that look like? Maybe at a kind of abstract level. Conceptually, what is this battle for resources look like? We can talk about concrete things later, but I think just to kind of give a flavor of that.
Well, one aspect of this I already mentioned is this ongoing fight that was going on for months between, open fight, which is something that Putin doesn't usually like. He prefers to, all those issues to be solved internally, in-house, without just talking about them publicly. I'm talking about, basically this military support to Wagner, because Prigozhin was insisting it wasn't enough. The MOD sort of kept, some sort of an awkward silence about this, but in the background they were saying no, actually they have enough supplies, it's all fine. But Prigozhin crossed the line that we thought existed many times over those months, because he was making those public threats against personally Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, which is again unprecedented. This is something that you just don't do in Russia publicly, or this is how it used to be. At least again, we're talking about new reality in this reality that Putin created when he decided to invade Ukraine. Well, this is possible, and I guess this is something we should get just used to. Yeah, things like that they're going to happen. And again, I think the prisoner part of this is very important, because we know that this winter actually, for some reason, we don't know what happened, but we assume that I was part of this huge conflict. Prigozhin, for some reason, couldn't, at some point, just like he couldn't recruit prisoners anymore. And now, actually, the MOD is doing that. And they, have been doing that since spring. And it's very important, because for Wagner, this, people, Russian prisoners, they were essentially one of the main sources of, new mercenaries, because they sustained incredible losses at Bakhmut. And I guess this conflict reached a boiling point this June, when the Ministry of Defense announced that they expect all volunteers, and I mean, Russian authorities, at least, they've been talking about Wagner, about this military group as, you know, volunteers, because according, I mean, it's ridiculous even mentioning it, but according to the Russian law, organizing a group like this is illegal. It's prohibited by law. Anyway, Prigozhin could do it for years, and now, yeah, Putin admitted very openly that, yeah, they were lying about it for years, you know, despite all the investigation and despite everyone knew Wagner's involvement in Syria, Ukraine since 2014 when the war actually started, Africa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, this June, the MOD announced that they expect everyone, including Wagner, to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. And of course, for Prigozhin, it's a vital issue. It's about his, you know, like survival, actually, political survivor, you know, like it's about his like influence on Putin, because it's all like, another way to look at it is just like this constant fight for Putin's attention that never ends. And there are even this, you know, like point of view that Putin actually likes it when his, you know, subordinates, when they fight for his attention, because this is how he, you know, feels this competition should work for a normal state development, whether it's normal or not. You know, the events of the last Friday, they showed you that, of course, it's not normal, because something like that can't happen in a normal country, as well as invading your, you know, your neighbor. That's too. But anyway, and I talked to someone who knows Prigozhin, and he told me that this decision that they should, you know, sign contracts with the MOD was like a critical point for him, when he decided, you know, I have nothing to lose. If I don't do it, if I don't do something, if I don't attract Putin's attention, I'm just gonna turn to nothing. Shoigu will have won, and, you know, my rule will be essentially over. Other people describe that as he just, you know, got insane. You know, that, again, that's your perspective. How are you gonna look at this? But again, now that we talk about it, it wasn't completely sort of like, just like, it didn't come just out of the blue, you know, it didn't just like happen. A long and very deep conflict was already on the table for, you know, for many months.
Thanks so much, Elizaveta. I'd like to just drop in a slightly different kind of vein of question here, which is the reaction of Russian society to these events. And I think it's quite an interesting question. I mean, the people that I was speaking to, there was panic and kind of concern about what was going on. Obviously, there's been a lot of speculation about these scenes in Rostov, where there were people sort of greeting some of the Wagner troops jubilantly, or whatever you want to call it. And I'd also like to hear from Hanna what the kind of reaction in Belarusian society, right, which has been quite an interesting question about what Belarusian society really thinks about the war and the kind of increasing integration with Russia. And so we'd love to hear about that. I mean, maybe we could go Jeremy, Hanna, and then Elizaveta just on that particular question. I think that would be.
Okay, I mean, I just wanted to really quickly pick up on your resources question as well. You know, I think to put that into perspective, we need to look back and see that, you know, Wagner was, the Wagner phenomenon in the war was itself a function of the lack of military resources that Russia had, and the fact that the kind of societal resources for total war and mobilization against a very effective adversary were just not there. So we can talk about this resources question in many different ways. And now you could read this as the kind of state's revenge more than the regime's revenge. Or, well, you know, we allowed some kind of improvisation through Wagner when the situation was critical. We've got a handle on it now. Of course, that's not clear really whether, you know, the Ukrainian counteroffensive will show that that's true or not. So different kinds of resources. We should distinguish those resources that made Wagner important to the regime from the dispute over money resources that Elizaveta was talking about, right? So from my perspective, the fact that he derived enormous monetary resources through being useful, and that he saw those monetary resources being taken away and given back to the MOD, perhaps prompted him to say, well, my other source of wealth and power and influence could easily trickle away, right? So we kind of need to disaggregate when we talk about resources. On the question of Russian society, yeah, I mean, like I said at the outset, in a sense, even those the passively loyal majority who still believe that Putin has strong legitimacy as president, they had a moment where the curtain was pulled away, right? The curtain was put back almost immediately, and in a sense, some people are saying that the fact that he keeps coming out and actually having to make public appearances and public pronouncements is him overcompensating for the fact that for a moment, the emperor had no clothes, right? And that became clear. That was clear to everybody. Having said that, Prigozhin does not have the visibility in Russian society that I sometimes think he has, right? There are plenty of people for whom he wasn't really on the radar up until now. So also on Rostov, you and I have discussed this, Tom, already. Yeah, I had a bit of a criticism of some of the Western press leaping on these signs of jubilation in Rostov as if Prigozhin was this widely popular figure, popular because he could depose Putin or end the war. I think that's really wide of the mark. And what we saw in Rostov was, in fact, very, very mixed. We saw these people having selfies with him and shaking his hands, but that's 100 people out of a million, right? What was behind the scenes, and what I think sometimes we lose sight of, if we look at things through the prism of the Western press, is the fact that there was a lot of panic and there was a lot of fear, as you said, Tom. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jeremy. No, excellent, insightful comments from you, Hannah. We'd love to hear about what people may have been thinking about this situation in Belarus. Obviously, very hard to kind of understand at the moment because of frankly, the huge crackdowns and repressions against Belarusian society since 2020. But your thoughts on this, please, would be wonderful.
Of course, I don't have any sociological survey right now to show you the results, but there is some evidence that I've been able to gather since Saturday, I think. So first of all, I spoke to some people, which of course doesn't prove anything, and this is just anecdotal evidence. But even those not necessarily anti-Lukashenko people inside the country mentioned that, well, Prigozhin is a war criminal. Like, why is he coming? Like, why? For what reason? What is he going to do there? In what capacity? For how long? There were so many questions, which are very legit, of course. We don't have answers to. But I think every sort of, because he is a foreigner, he's not someone from Belarus. So people naturally, even again, those who might support the regime or might be undecided, have many questions. But actually yesterday, one of the propagandists, one of the very, sort of notorious propagandists in the country, Igor Tur, confirmed my assumptions. And he said, he actually wrote a post that we should change the image of Wagner because they're not that bad. They're nice and reflective people. And he said that because this news of potential arrival of Wagner militants to Belarus was perceived negatively by a share of the Belarusian population. And I was like, yes. So he basically revealed that this, the moods in the society. And there are several reasons for that. Again, as I mentioned, right, these are just for some foreign people, they're Russians who are coming to Belarus, apparently, right? So of course, there is no evidence that Wagner militants are going to come. They haven't come yet. So there is evidence about some construction happening in a military unit in Nasipovich, but otherwise we haven't seen them in Belarus, even though Lukashenko yesterday confirmed that Prigozhin was there. So the reasons why Belarusians are against or feel concerned and sort of negatively assessing, well, first of all, because of toxicity, right, of these people. They also heard about war crimes. They heard about a sledgehammer, which is a symbol of this entire situation. And by the way, that propagandist also mentioned that, well, this is not only about a sledgehammer, this is also like about them being sort of helping the Kremlin, Russia, and so on. It's also this notion of independence, which is very important. We think about Lukashenko as a puppet of Putin. But most Belarusians, the absolute majority of Belarusians, want to see their country as independent. And this is confirmed by surveys here throughout all these decades. This didn't change. The amount of people who want to sort of join Russia is very marginal. Even the propaganda hasn't been able to change that for years. And I think this is important. So Belarusians do not want to see their country as some sort of annex to Russia. And of course, well, all of these sort of instabilities and concerns coming out of it, right? Is Belarus going to be a target? Is it going to provoke Ukrainians? Is it going to provoke the Westerners, right? How would they behave? Because they've been already saying that we should strengthen the border with Belarus, right? So all of this for Belarusians is very unclear, and they don't want that. And this is why the image of Lukashenko as this negotiator in chief, you know, this wise politician, is not as strong as they would like it to have, because people also understand the consequences. And lastly, very shortly, so another sort of not direct evidence why Belarusians wouldn't like it is, of course, all the surveys that we have since the beginning of the full-scale invasion last year. The majority, the absolute majority of Belarusians are against the deployment of Belarusian troops and being dragged, involved in this conflict, in this war at all. And they also don't want Russian nukes, which is also confirmed by the survey, right? And we can talk about this later, but here I'll stop.
No, thank you, Hanna. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really, really important to keep Belarusian society in this frame. It's an important actor, if obviously one that can be hard to kind of read from the outside, perhaps. I have two questions for Elizaveta, if that's possible. The first is just sort of how you we've kind of talked about panic and concern about the kind of Prigozhin events, the March of Justice, the March on Moscow, etc., from society side. And I just wanted to ask if that kind of description, very rough, kind of gels with or fits with what you have kind of observed insofar as that's possible. And then the second is, I think there's a question in the chat from our listeners and viewers, which I'd like to ask you, which regards how likely is it that the Wagner units can be integrated into regular Russian military as productive fighting units. But let's come to that in a moment. Your views on society's reaction to the Wagner events.
Okay, I'm probably going to disappoint you. So I'm Russian. I work for the BBC Russian service, and frankly, I have no idea how Russian society reacted. We just don't know. The main emotion I've been observing through those days is curiosity, and this is what I saw in Rostov. Frankly, curiosity, because I know that many outlets, Western outlets, they saw all those, like videos of people, like shaking hands with Wagner mercenaries or applauding Prigozhin as he was leaving Rostov, and took it as a sign of, huge support that, like Russians and people in Rostov-on-Don, which is very close to the front line, relatively close to the front line, much closer than Moscow, apparently have for him. I don't think he's a very popular figure. I agree with Jeremy. There's a small part of Russian society of people who actually follows, like what's been going on in Ukraine, what's going on with the Russian army. And among those people, including, journalists, the elites, ordinary Russians, pro-war, like Russian correspondents, Z-bloggers, as we call them. Of course, for them, Prigozhin is a key figure, and everyone has like different opinions about him. Some think he's the most, basically he's the most effective, general, air quotes, in the Russian army. Other people think that he's just a cruel, unbelievable, creature who just kills, like people with sledgehammers with no accountability whatsoever, just like almost like, I don't know, like a mad sort of like dog that Putin, like got off the leash. Again, that's a perspective of people who follow it. But I don't have any surveys, and I don't think you can trust any sociology going on in Russia, as it's an authoritarian, state. But my feeling is just, I'm talking about my feelings here, that most Russians are still indifferent to what's going on in Ukraine. Jeremy said passively loyal. I'd say passively indifferent. They just think it has no effect on their everyday life. And of course, what happened to Prigozhin was different, because, it wasn't just, like Russian troops killing people in Ukraine and then the country. You had people marching on Moscow, like just in the middle of the day, meeting no resistance whatsoever. But again, I felt that the main emotion was not fear. It was curiosity. it was curiosity. People were just like, oh my God, we have this major breaking news. Let's just, let's read Telegram. Let's see what's going on. I was really, it was funny. So Medusa, this, very prominent Russian publication, asked its readers, what do they think about the situation? And they talked to some guy in Rostov, and he said, yeah, it's unprecedented. Never seen anything like that. We have saw tanks in like in a city center. And what I'm thinking about right now, so I'm actually really looking forward to Ekaterina Shulman's, YouTube live video. It's a very, very prominent Russian political scientist, because I'm really interested what will, what does she have to say about this? This person had tanks in a city, and all he was like, apparently, like a quite intelligent person, if this guy, likes Ekaterina Shulman, but he was more interested in analysis. What does it mean? So I think that's very interesting. But I think few major takeaways that, of course, we can get here. No one actually supported Putin. We didn't see any signs of support, like not in Moscow, not in Rostov. Okay, in Rostov, you can explain it by, people were scared. They couldn't just, fight the tanks, right? But in other cities, we didn't see any signs of, like rallies or like huge display of public support, even that Putin now tried to pretend that actually the whole nation sort of like, got sort of like united around him in the army. That never happened. No one did that. On the other hand, no one really supported Prigozhin either. No big forces said, yeah, you know what, you're right. We're going to march with you on Moscow. We're going to, just join this march of justice. So, I mean, I think it's really telling about the current state of Russian society. Sometimes it just feels that people will have whatever. Like if Prigozhin took Moscow, I mean, of course, something that we should remember about it, if Putin decided to escalate, like on Saturday and Friday, there could be a horrible bloodshed. We can't rule that out, and the reaction could be quite different. But right now, I remember talking to, like people in Moscow, because I still have friends in Moscow, people that I know in Moscow, and I'm like, what's the situation? What's going on? Like on Saturday and Friday, they're like, everything's fine. People are just, like hanging out. It's a holiday week. And yeah, we got, like there's going to be an extra holiday day on Monday, because Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, who, by the way, didn't openly express his full support for Putin, like on Friday and Saturday. He announced an extra day off on Monday, and people were very happy about it, and they never canceled it. So I guess something good for for people who live in Moscow, something good came out of it. But no, it's truly remarkable. I think one thing I want to add is right now people who actually like were scared about it and think it was problematic and think it's a sign of like a deep weakness of the state. What they talk about right now is that it appears that we live in a reality where Russia, you can go to prison or get jailed for an innocent anti-war protest or for your political activities, because Alexei Navalny, the most prominent opposition politician, opposition politician in the world, regardless of what you think of him, these days he's being prosecuted for his extremist activities, and that can add like 30 years to his prison term, and he's already in prison. And it turns out that what he was doing, the rallies, like investigations, or again, just innocent anti-war protests, including on social media, are more dangerous for the state than this rebellion, because no one is going to be prosecuted for this one. And that's just remarkable, I think. Just today, a very famous Russian journalist, I don't know if he was already sentenced, but yesterday, prosecution demanded 9 years of prison for him. He's not in Russia, for spreading the so-called fakes about mass murders in Bucha that the Russian army committed when the Bucha was occupied last spring, and he's looking for 9 years for that. And Prigozhin is just going to go to Belarus. We don't know what's going to happen for them, but shooting down a couple of helicopters, a very important military plane, L-22. Apparently, you can do it, and of course, it's a sign of weakness. And of course, everyone noticed that. Ordinary Russians, elites, people in the West, people in Ukraine, everyone.
Thank you, Elizaveta. No, I think that that final point you're making, this kind of disconnect between the situation facing Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, that he's facing an additional 30 years in prison on what seem to be fairly trumped up charges, and what has happened to Prigozhin and Wagner since last weekend is obviously is a picture that's really plain to see, and we have a question on that from one of our viewers, Tatiana Romashko. And actually, I think just because we're talking about it, let's pick up on Tatiana's question, which is, I'm going to summarize it, which is a kind of what kind of possibilities does this strange situation, right, where you see kind of selective justice very clearly, you see weakness from the head of the state, alleged weakness. What kind of possibilities does that create? I mean, I think just a really short. If you have any comments on that particular question, really short. And then there's a question also from Charles McFedron, which is for Hanna, which is for you, Hanna, which is where does this situation leave the Belarusian opposition? On the weekend, they effectively called for an uprising before the deal. I think your thoughts on that would also be really great. But first, maybe we could go to Jeremy and then Hanna. And then if Elizaveta, you want to join in, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Tatiana, for the question. What possibilities for counter movement? I mean, possibly the outcome of this will be a little bit like Elizaveta already described. In fact, a ratcheting up of the kind of double standards in Russian society and the kind of two-track application of the law. So people that are against the war and against the regime are likely to encounter much more individualized repression, preemptive repression, because, again, as Elizaveta said, it's not the people who are actually guilty of this that are going to be paying the consequences, right? There'll be there'll have to be a campaign against internal enemies, right? And as we know from Russian history, that's going to affect people that don't necessarily have anything to do with the regime and don't necessarily have anything to do with the opposition either. So what I'm afraid of is that there'll be much more quasi-random internal repression because they've only really just started. That's the other thing. There are plenty of people who have made social media posts against the war and against the regime that haven't been punished. There's almost an infinite resource of people to point the finger at and continue to for the regime to continue to compensate in these ways by diverting the attention of the public.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hanna, I'd love your thoughts on this question from Charles McFedron. What's next for the Belarusian opposition after their call at the weekend for an uprising?
Right. So thank you very much for the question. Well, there was no direct call for the uprising. I mean, there was no, if you mean the Belarusian opposition, I think it would be cynical for them and generally for anyone to call on Belarusians to go out to the streets and protest right now. The situation in Belarus should be called a state terror. That's a now totalitarian state, and any street activity is banned. So whatever people do, even if they comment or like on Facebook, they can be sent to jail. So this is just not possible. What they did instead, so there were several important announcements, I would say. So the United Transition Cabinet, which is part of this sort of pro-democracy movement, they're of course outside of Belarus right now for obvious reasons. So they kind of mentioned the geopolitical perspective and direction where the country should go. So they mentioned that Belarus is going to leave the CIS, CSTO, and the union state with Russia, which is perhaps, it might kind of seem that, well, what is that? It's very abstract announcement. But I think giving that perspective for Belarusians is kind of important. Then there was also the Kalinowski regiment, those Belarusian fighters in Ukraine who are fighting against the Russian army, helping Ukrainians. They said that, well, also kind of we are sort of working as well. And this is so they also addressed the military in Belarus, asking them not to join any activities in Russia and so on. So there were like several kind of important announcements, but or appeals rather, but when it comes to the situation inside on the ground, of course, people do follow, right? But they, there is not much they can do. If you think that people would go out to the streets and protest and Putin will think that, okay, so let's not send Wagner militants to Belarus, it's not going to happen. So of course, for people, logically and naturally, this is dangerous, but then the reaction is kind of, what can they do, right, about it? So there is a lot of resistance underground, and this is happening. This has been happening since 2020, basically, despite all this state terror. And since the full-scale invasion, it only escalated, increased. So we know about these railway partisans who organized at least 80 sabotage actions, stopping the movement of Russian troops. There is some other evidence. So I would expect this to continue. When it comes to the democratic forces themselves, what can they do? Again, not kind of much in the sense that this will not provoke an immediate reaction. Of course, they will continue lobbying among Western countries, showing that, there is the regime, their decisions, but also there are Belarusians, and they should support Belarusians because they're against the regime, they're against the invasion, and so on. So they will perhaps do that, which is, again, a very important work. But I think when it comes to this wider sort of, civil society movement, let's put it this way, I think this is also very interesting because the work is now, will look like they will try to explain the meaning of this whole thing. Because not only do we have the potential of transferring of Wagner militants arriving, Wagner militants arriving to Belarus, but also the transfer of Russian nukes, which is also a very dangerous development. And the Kremlin might not use nukes in Belarus, but still it's a threat to Belarusian independence. So I think all this explanatory work and information about this, which we journalists do from outside the country, analysts, experts, so we explain, civil society also follow it. We have amazing sort of alternative, I think, surveillance system, which is a monitoring group, Belaruski Hayun, who have thousands of people on the ground, and they send us information. So all of this together, I think this collaboration between people on the ground, sending information, leaking, kind of telling what's happening, and us analyzing and then explaining to the population is something that perhaps the priority, something very important that we can do right now.
Thank you, Hanna. I'm going to try, I've got 2 points that I'd like to focus on in the remaining 10 minutes that we have together. I just want to say thank you to all our panelists and obviously our listeners, viewers so far. I think some of the questions have been really, really good. And I think it's turning out to be a fantastic discussion, so thank you. So my 2 questions are, and we can take them in whichever order you wish, are 1, what advice or I'm going to say hints or tips do you have for our viewers and how they should be thinking about what's happening? How can they try and filter out the noise? I think we saw a lot of this over the past less than a week. And I think you're kind of expert, everyone here is a hugely experienced journalist, researcher, and so on. So how can, any tips on how to make sense of this kind of fog, this noise, I think would be really useful. And the second thing is, if you can speculate, what's next? Elizaveta, I'm going to go to you first, if that's possible. I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Sure. Well, as for tips, I would like to hear some tips myself. What to make of it, how to deal with it, because it's I started with it. It's a mess. It's just a hot mess, and of course, that's more to your second question. It proved that Russian regime is not as strong as Putin was ready to admit and definitely wanted to show, because it's a sign of huge weakness, and it's much less stable than, again, many people thought. Maybe even some people in the West, and of course, again, we're heading to this uncharted territory where basically everything can happen, just come out of nowhere or out of somewhere. But again, everything is possible at this point. So we're just going to follow it as journalists and experts. I think something that you can expect, and we already seen some of it. Putin probably going to stop those experiments about encouraging and sponsoring and supporting those less sort of like conventional forces fighting in Ukraine, because his takeaway from this whole thing is probably going to be, oh, those people who spend the entire year telling me that Prigozhin is not reliable, you can't trust him, you can't give him that much resources, you can certainly not give him prisoners, because I think it's also very important. It's a very important social factor in Russia, because thousands of Russian prisoners, they were pardoned by Putin and sent to the front line, and some of them are starting to come back. And among those people are murderers, rapists, and it's a huge, social issue, and it's going to be one, because we already so complex about like how to bury these people when they die. Do you bury them like heroes? Well, you can't, because like you're probably gonna give this huge state funeral to someone who killed an old Russian woman, for her pension, and that already happened. I'm not making those things facts, or like, and I'm sure that many people were, they were telling Putin this, like, stop encouraging people who execute their own soldiers with sledgehammer. I'm talking about Evgeny Prigozhin, this mercenary who was indeed executed with a sledgehammer after he came from the Ukrainian captivity. And I think Putin is he's not going to bet on someone as unreliable ever again. And I think that there are many speculation right now that he's probably going to have to find a scapegoat, that he's probably going to have to fire like Shoigu or Gerasimov or something very senior. I'm not going to make any predictions, because I just don't want to look like a fool. But I would think, I'm being very cautious here, that at this situation, Putin is going to do the opposite. He's going to rely on people that he knows, and on people that he knows are loyal to him. I'm talking about Shoigu, I'm talking about Gerasimov. We suddenly see Zolotov, the head of Rosgvardia, Russian National Guard, in the picture again. We haven't heard anything from him for a month, and suddenly he's there near Putin. There are some speculation that he's going to get some of those resources that the government is going to take from Wagner, right? I'm talking about the FSB, and certainly after this display of weakness that Putin and Russia have showed, I would unfortunately expect those, internal repressions to become even more brutal, even though sometimes I question myself, can they be more brutal? In that department, there's always a room, for improvement for Putin and the Kremlin. And unfortunately, we've seen that many times in the last, 16, 17 months, that whenever something doesn't go according to the plan, many things have gone completely wrong, even though, Peskov, Putin, they've been insisting that everything goes according to the plan. I wonder if they planned this, this rebellion. I would think not. But every time something like this happens, they tend to escalate in Ukraine just by punishing civilians, because they can't, capture Ukraine. We haven't seen any major advance in month. If you don't count Bakhmut, that, basically, essentially has been completely destroyed. There are ruins. This city doesn't exist anymore. So every time something like this happens, Crimea Bridge, et cetera, Putin and, Russia, the Russian army, they just start shelling Ukraine, killing Ukrainian civilians. And unfortunately, this is something that I fear we may see after what happened in Russia last week, unfortunately.
Thank you, Elizaveta. No, I think the consequences for Ukrainian civilians should absolutely be at the forefront of our minds in this situation. This is a situation that's affecting the country every day. Jeremy, your thoughts on tips / what's next, and then finally I think we'd like to hear from Hanna if possible, and then we'll wrap up. I just want to say thank you again to everybody for joining us today.
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of where we get we get obsessed with the minutiae, we get obsessed with unfolding events and the way that we have access to them through all of these social media, and of course I think sometimes forces all of us into a position where we can be swept up by that and start too seriously considering all kinds of outlandish versions of events, right? Whereas in reality, these things are a hot mess, as you said earlier, I think, Elizaveta, right? So, you know, there's so many actors involved, so many contingencies that our obsession with the blow-by-blow account sometimes kind of clouds our judgment to see that actually a lot of it cannot be rationally kind of explained. Even trying to disaggregate and get like a minute-by-minute account, you're going to get so many conflicting perspectives on it. So it's better just to step back, to defocus from Putin, because we always look at Putin too much. Maybe even to defocus from Prigozhin. You know, after all, he has been a bit player in the war, as we just heard. You know, what is his crowning achievement? Destroying a small Ukrainian city. For what? For nothing, right? Didn't help Russia in the slightest. What would I focus on? I would focus on how this and other events show that when countries, and again, maybe Russia's not, it's not really about Russia, when countries unleash wars of aggression, neo-imperialist adventures, the suffering and the costs that are dealt out to the other country, the other group, inevitably come home, right? The revenge of the colony on the metropolis, right? So what we will see in Russia is what Russia did to the Donbass, the Donbassization of Russia. So more and more repressive and draconian laws, a rollback of even basic rule of law and habeas corpus for ordinary citizens, the increasing use of, you know, states of exception, emergency decrees, allowing the law enforcement and security services to basically interrupt what we heard earlier, which is the relative indifference of Russians to the war in Ukraine. So these things, political murders, which we've already seen, more open, violent conflicts spill out, which previously could have been dealt with more politically, with Putin as an arbiter. So kind of this Donbassization of Russia, which again, I would say is not really a function of Russia itself, Russia's war on Ukraine itself. It's something that we see in our own societies, right? As a result of our own societies' aggression and unjustified neocolonial adventures, we get blowback on our own societies, and the erosion of civil liberties, the erosion of the independence of the media as a result. So put it into perspective.
Thank you, Jeremy. No, I think that's it's a sad, but it's unfortunately it's a slightly catchy term, the Donbassization of Russia. We'll be following it closely here at Open Democracy. Hanna, finally, we'd love to hear from you about your thoughts about, first on any hints or tips for our readers about how they can make sense or step back or what they should be focusing on, and finally, what you think might happen next, if you can join us in the speculation.
Sure. I mean, I have only 2 minutes apparently, but I'll try to be as fast as possible. So first of all, you see that Belarus is being forgotten very often, as being ignored, is being considered as an unimportant country, which is a shame, because for Putin, we have seen that this is a kind of a very strategically important country. Strategically important territory, because without Belarus, he wouldn't be able, I think, the offensive, the invasion would have been much weaker for sure. When he thinks about nuclear weapons, he transfers them to Belarus. When he thinks about Wagner militants, he offers them Belarus as a territory, as an area where they can go. So it's kind of very important, which is again scary, because, and this is something that I would like the readers and the audience right now to focus on, is this threat to independence. And I've heard a lot from Western experts and politicians, diplomats, that, well, okay, so Putin is not going to use Russian nukes right now. Why, why from Belarus? Well, even if he doesn't use them, if there are no intentions of using them, this makes Belarus really closer to Russia in so many ways. There will be more Russian troops and so on. So this is like a threat to independence. Second, we don't have now these beautiful pictures of mass protests in Belarus, and many think that this is over. Well, again, sociology, this Chatham House reports and some non-public surveys that I have access to, and evidence show us that people have not given up. People are still resisting, perhaps in the underground. It's very hard to show. That's why I think we don't see it in media, but I hope that Open Democracy and BBC Russian will report more on that since we're here. The moods are, again, very, very different among the society, as I've been trying to explain and show, and we can safely assume that those are the moods also among the elites. Because there are different people who have access to different resources and so on. So this is not only Lukashenko's circle, right? This is wider. And splitting the elites would be now the goal, I think, the aim of the democratic movement and generally of perhaps Westerners as well. So Crimean annexation, like the revolution or resistance is not over, in kind of different moods where we, or I guess the democratic movement can build on, which is very interesting. Lisa said that Putin has weakened, which means that Lukashenko would be also weaker, even though he's now trying to present himself as this, tough, cool guy. But I think this also opens up some opportunities here. So, which leads us to another sort of recommendation: prioritize Belarus in that sense, because if the conflict is not solved in Belarus, if the crisis is not solved, then it's going to be a gray area. It's going to be like Donbass or those areas that Russia occupied. So Belarus is not an afterthought. This is a very strategically important area and country. And perhaps the prediction here, I think, well, there are many scenarios, right? And I can write about them for for the next year, perhaps, publish them every week. But first of all, now, because of Wagner, all of these kind of developments, of course, the fate of Lukashenko and the regime in Belarus is tying up, is kind of, how to say, tying up, right, closer with the Kremlin, with Putin himself, which is kind of, well, I don't know how to assess it, whether it's good or bad. I mean, this is good in terms of, like, hopefully Putin will be defeated, right? So it means that the regime in Belarus will be also weakened and well, eventually, hopefully defeated. But then for Belarus as a country and for us as a nation, this is, of course, dangerous. And I tried to explain that before, the Crimean annexation. But I think psychologically, in people's minds, there is also some sort of disconnection with the regime and elites in general, with those who want Belarus to be involved in the war, with those who now are praising Wagner militants. And, because for years, for decades, Lukashenko has built his image as this, peacemaker, as someone who is a donor, who is a giver of peace and stability in the country. And now he has made Belarus a gray area, an unstable country, an unreliable partner, neighbor, a co-aggressor in the first place. So I think all of this in people's minds will backfire in the future, right? So because they also see it. So these two thoughts as to sort of prediction in the way where it can go, I'll leave you with this.
Thank you so much, Hanna. No, that's really important. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more coverage of Belarus, actually, as a result of, unfortunately, of these events over the next couple of weeks. I think public interest has certainly been reignited. I would say from Open Democracy side, we do have relatively regular coverage of Belarus, and I have posted a link in the chat if you wish to check it out. On that note, I'm going to call this discussion to an end. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Jeremy Morris, Hanna Liubakova, and Elizaveta Fokht from BBC. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. I know that our readers and listeners have really appreciated your insights. It's built on many years of observation, of reporting, of research, and it's absolutely the kind of people that we want to be hearing from right now to make sense of the current events. So I'm going to say thank you. I'm also going to say thank you to the audience for asking some excellent questions and joining us on this journey. Finally, I'm going to do a plug for the Open Democracy crowdfunder. We have reached a third of our total in about 3 or 4 days. We're fundraising to make sure that we can continue our coverage of Russia's war against Ukraine and indeed the events in Belarus. We work a lot with Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian journalists. You can support that work in the link, or please get in touch, tom.rowley@opendemocracy.net. Thank you. I wish everyone a pleasant afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.